Imagine yourself 45 years old, married with 3 children. Both you and your spouse have a job and are responsible parents, but then some bad luck comes your way. Maybe you lose your job and have trouble finding another one. Maybe a family member gets sick and you find yourself drowning in medical bills. Maybe you become hurt and disabled. Whatever this particular form of bad luck it takes, you find yourself in financial trouble. You have to pay your mortgage on time. You have to make your insurance payments on time. You have lots of bills that must be paid at a specific time, and those bills take what money you have first. Whatever's left over is used to buy food. While food may be the most important need in terms of living, it is also the one part of your budget that is most flexible. And so the thing you need most in life is the first thing you sacrifice. Food is your greatest need, yet it is your food budget that is stretched first. As you increasingly stretch your food budget and are unable to eat well, maybe you turn to a food pantry for assistance. If you live in Payne County, Oklahoma, then the food pantry you turn to is this one. It's called Our Daily Bread, and it's a modern food pantry in the sense that they like to refer themselves as a food and resource center, but we'll just refer to them as food pantry throughout this lecture. What we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to give you a tour of this food pantry. We're going to let you see it from the perspective of the people who come here for assistance, from the perspective of the people who run the place. We're going to talk a bit about the culture of equality and community that's nurtured here, and we're also going to discuss the concept of food security. Now remember, you're a 5-person household, and so you're coming here for some assistance with your food. So what does your household look like? Well, if you're like the typical 5-person household that comes here, you need about $96,000 per year for your family to meet its basic expenses. That's just basic things like housing, like automobile, food, health care, nothing luxurious, just your basic stuff, $96,000. Yet the average 5-person household that comes here only makes about $30,000 a year. And that's the average, so half of those 5-person households that come here are actually making less than that. So these households are not even coming close to meeting their basic needs. This means they're either having to go without, they're having to acquire it through government assistance, or having to acquire it through charity. And so that's why they come here. And another thing I can tell you about the households that come here, they can come here up to 12 times a year, about every 30 days. But only of those people, of all the households who come here in any time in a year, 1/3 only come once a year, even though they can come 12. Less than 2% come every single month. And so most of the people coming here are not using it as a regular source of free food. It's a place that helps them stretch their food budget when they need to during particularly tough times. Now we're assuming that you're coming here for food assistance to Our Daily Bread for the first time. Well, your first time here, you're going to come in and there'll be someone here to greet you and they'll check you in. You'll get a ticket and that tells you your number, and then you'll take a seat until you're called. And then at some point an intake volunteer is going to call you and you come into the office to have a brief chat with them. And what they're going to do here is, if it's your first visit, they're going to put you in the system, the Charity Tracker software system. And that's an online database where anytime someone acquires charitable assistance from a nonprofit organization in Stillwater, it's entered in the database, whether they get the assistance here or whether Salvation Army or something like that. And the purpose of the database is one where you can't manage what you don't measure. And so to know the state of need in our community and how well we're doing in helping them, the communities in Payne County want these things to be measured. You know, earlier I was able to tell you that of all the people who come here in any one year, 1/3 of them only come once. Well, I'm able to tell you that because of the Charity Tracker system. Every time you come here, it will be recorded in the Charity Tracker system. And so, a nonprofit organization that gets most of its money from donors, you need to be accountable to the donors and tell them what you're doing with that money, and that's what the Charity Tracker helps us do. And in Charity Tracker, we'll put information on everybody in your household, including kids, their names, ages, things like that. So we have an idea of the people we're serving, and so that maybe your spouse can come and get free food instead of you sometime. And another purpose of checking you in here and getting information from you is to make sure that you meet the income requirements. You have to make below a certain amount of income to be able to acquire food here on a regular basis. Part of that is because it's only fair to make sure the little food we have to give goes to those who need it, and government laws require it. A lot of the food that is made available here is made available for free by the United States government, and the government has laws that you can't give the free food to people over a certain income. So what are those incomes like? If you're a one-person household, you need to make less than $24,000 to be able to acquire food here on a regular basis. If you're a five-person household, you need to be able to make less than $54,000 to acquire food on a regular basis. Now, even if you don't meet those requirements and you're really in a bind, every now and then they can still help you. They'll take you back there and they'll just make sure you don't get any food from the government sources. And also sometimes we have emergencies and families come here and maybe it hasn't been 30 days so they can't come here for the next visit. Or maybe they come here when Our Daily Bread is not open for shopping. But they're really in a bind, they need some emergency food. We always have these packets of food, emergency food baskets that we can give people. So anybody who comes here and is really in need is always going to leave with some food. And now, once you're checked in, you'll come back out here, you'll sit down and you'll wait to be called to go shop. And once your name is called, you'll come back here and you can begin your shopping. And there's always a shopping assistant here to help you. So I'll kind of pretend like I'm your shopping assistant today. Remember, you're a five-person household. And so there's a different card here for each different size household. If you are a one-person household, you'd have the pink card, but you're a five-person household, so we'll use a white card, and that allows us to make sure that larger size households get more food. And so what we do, the shopping assistant will guide you through the process, and we'll start here. And there's different sections here we'll come through. And so this is the cereal aisle, and the shopping assistant will look at cereals and say, well, you can have 2 items. So then you're able to pick out any 2 items you want from the cereal aisle. So this isn't the type of food pantry where they just give you a bunch of foods in a bag and you have to take whatever's given to you. You get to shop for the foods you want. It's a way of treating people with dignity, and it also minimizes waste. Here we have the canned vegetables section, and since you're a 5-person household, you can get as many as 5 different items here. If your card says that you have an infant, then sometimes you can come here and maybe get a bag that has some diapers and maybe some infant formula and other things. And the process just continues like this. You go through the different sections. Here's beans. Beans, you can have 5 items. Protein, you can have 4 items. And canned soup, you can have 4 items. And then we have flex, just means kind of anything. There you can have 5 items. And so on household products, you can have just 2 different items. So it's not just food. You know, households also need paper towels, toilet paper, things like that. Fruit, you can have 4 items. Often we have a surplus of items, like especially bread that grocery stores have donated to us, and so sometimes you'll have a sign that says take all that you can use. So if you had a large family and you could use 3 of these big loaves, you're welcome to take it. We continue. There's a rice and pasta aisle, 3 items. Sometimes there's a surplus item. So here this says you can just choose 6 items no matter how large your family is. Crackers, you can choose 2 items. Beverages, 2 items. Notice there's no soda here, and you haven't seen any candy or anything. That's because food pantries today make a deliberate effort to only have healthy food. The main problem that food insecure households have is not calories. It's calories of healthy food. And so we make a deliberate attempt to only have healthy food here. And as you go through here, you'll see most of the food is very healthy. Over here in the bread aisle, it says you can choose 1 item, but they have to be you could choose 2 items, but they have to be 2 different items. And now we're getting to the refrigerated section and the freezer section. And what you do here is you come to each store, and so this says 1 item, and so no matter how large your household is, you can only choose 1 item from here. You can see a lot of this was given to us by grocery stores in town. So sometimes we even have prepared meals here in town. Here you can have 3 items. Here, 1 item. Here, 1 gallon of milk. And the eggs and milk, this was something that it was difficult for Our Daily Bread to acquire through the normal sources, so they ran a fundraising campaign where people are donating a certain amount every month that are used to buy fresh fruit, fresh milk and eggs for households. And here we have our freezer section. And here, instead of just telling you how many you can get behind each door, you have to look at your card. And so the frozen section, door 1, it says 1 item. So you can get 1 item from there. Door 2, 1 item. Door 3, 2 items. Door 4, 1 items. And it used to be that everybody got the same amount from each door no matter how large the household was. But then we did some research at OSU where we were measuring the amount of food that each households were getting over many months, and what we found that 1-person households were getting about 14 days worth of food, but 5-person households were only getting about 5 or 6 days worth of food. And that was because no matter how large your household was, you got the same amount from each one of these doors. And so a 5-person household, say, got 1 steak. A 1-person household got 1 steak. And once we saw those numbers, they realized that that wasn't quite fair. The amount of food should increase according to household size, and they changed this method accordingly. Sometimes you'll see a freezer like this where this one says take 3, and a lot of times you'll find seafood here, like from the local Red Lobster. Now this isn't, a shopping session is not currently in right now. If the shopping section was in, you would see all of these pallets here just overloaded with fresh fruits and vegetables. And unless there are bags like this, usually if there are bags like this, we'll say 1 bag per household. But for the rest of the fruits and vegetables, we'll say take as much fruits and vegetables as you want. Usually anytime a household comes here, they can get as much fresh produce as they want. And that again is part of the culture of modern food pantries to really emphasize the importance of healthy eating. Well, let's say if you were shopping here, your shopping cart would be full of groceries now, and we'd round the corner here, and then the shopping assistant would go with you to the exit and they'd help you load your car. And now we may be wondering, well, just how much food would this 5-person household be taking away? Well, we did some studies and we measured that. What we found is that, so a 5-person household, even though they could come here once a month, so about 12 times a year, on average they only come about 4 times. And at each visit, this cart will be loaded with about 65,000 calories. And that's about 7 or 8 days of food for the household. The value of the food in the cart will be about $150, and that will comprise about it would free up about 16% of the household's food budget. So this is not a place where someone can come and get all the food they need for the household. It only gives them about 16%. And so households are not relying on this as their exclusive food source. What we're here for is we're serving the idea that, almost half of the households that come here have children. And so when money gets tight and that food budget gets stretched, the last thing we want is for households to have to cut back on the amount of food that the children eat, and also the healthfulness of the food, the healthiness of the food. Now let's look at Our Daily Bread from the perspective of those who run it. To understand how a food pantry operates, it's useful to contrast it to the conventional food system. Most of us acquire our food from a grocery store, and most of those stores are in a profit-driven food system where a corporation performs all the coordination. The corporation hires the people to procure different types of food and ships those food to massive distribution centers. From those distribution centers, the food is then shipped to individual grocery stores, and all of this is controlled by management at corporate headquarters. Its goal is to generate profits for the corporation, and it serves people with money to buy food very well. Now consider the food pantry system. It too is embedded in a hierarchical structure. This is the warehouse where food at Our Daily Bread is stored. All the food here comes from two sources: one, food banks, and two, retail recovery. Retail recovery is when volunteers here at the food pantry visit local food establishments for food donations, and food banks are akin to the distribution centers in the conventional food system. Let's talk about food banks first. Just as a grocery store obtains its food from a distribution center, the food pantry acquires much of its food from a food bank. Now, most food pantries are formally affiliated with a specific food bank. Our Daily Bread is affiliated with the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma, located in Oklahoma City. Likewise, this food bank and all food banks are affiliated with the nonprofit organization called Feeding America, who coordinates all of the food flows in the food pantry system. Now, any organization can just give away free food and call itself a food pantry, but when I say food pantry here, I mean a food pantry affiliated with a food bank, and that food bank in turn is affiliated with Feeding America. There are about 200 food banks associated with Feeding America and about 60,000 food pantries associated with those food banks. In the conventional food system, a single corporation owns a set of distribution centers and grocery stores. But in the food pantry system, Feeding America does not own food banks, and food banks do not own food pantries. Each of these entities, Feeding America, each food bank, each food pantry, is a nonprofit organization accountable to a board of directors. And instead of being driven by profits, they are driven by the philanthropic goal of taking donations of both food and money and finding the most equitable way to distribute this food to the food insecure. The conventional food system gets its money from consumers, and it serves the people who have the money. The food pantry system gets its money and food from donations and government assistance, and it serves people who lack money. The affiliation of food pantries with food banks and food banks with Feeding America means that they all work together under a common set of rules. They follow these common rules for three reasons. One is that it allows them all access to free government food. Two, those rules express a common set of values. And three, it allows them to distribute food efficiently. Just as a corporation has procurers which acquire food, Feeding America acquires food donations, free government food, and purchases food as well. Just as the corporation makes market or profit-driven decisions about which food to ship to distribution centers, Feeding America makes market-based decisions about which foods to send to food banks. But that market is not profit-driven, and it's quite different from the markets you're accustomed to. Feeding America wants to make sure that the food it has available is delivered to each food bank according to the food bank's needs. It measures needs. To measure needs, it establishes what we call a goal factor for each food bank that determines how many poor people that food bank serves relative to the total number of poor people served by all food banks. It then allocates food to each food bank based on the size of their goal factor. The higher a food bank's goal factor, the more people it serves relative to others, and so the more food they get. This is why we say the food pantry system allocates food based on need, not profits. Before 2005, Feeding America used a system where each food bank received an amount of food that was proportional to the number of low-income people in its area. That is, proportional to its goal factor. That amount of food was measured in pounds. The food bank could not choose which types of food they would receive, and each food bank received roughly the same mix of food. Now, this had some problems because most food banks receive only 25% of its food from Feeding America. The other 75% it acquires on its own, like direct donations from manufacturers, donations from grocery stores, and the like. If Feeding America happens to procure a large amount of peanut butter, it distributed that peanut butter to food banks based on their goal factor. However, what if, say, the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma had already acquired lots of peanut butter from other sources? It would have been better if other food banks received the peanut butter from Feeding America and the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma received other types of protein from Feeding America, like canned tuna. Here's another example. A food bank in Idaho would sometimes receive a shipment of potatoes from Feeding America, even though they often had large inventories of potatoes from local farmers, as Idaho is a large potato growing region. It would have liked to be able to tell tell Feeding America, don't send us potatoes. We have plenty. Replace the potatoes with something we have less of, like peanut butter. However, there was no way to do this. See, the problem was that Feeding America simply didn't know what the inventories were at each food bank, and there wasn't a good method for food banks to communicate this information to Feeding America. So they invented a system to do just that. Starting in 2005, Feeding America began distributing food to food banks through a market, an auction system using virtual money. And the auction works like this. A fake or virtual currency called shares were created. Now, at first, each food bank received a number of shares based on its goal factor, meaning the amount of virtual currency it received was based on the number of poor people in its vicinity relative to the national average. The more poor people in your area, the more shares you received. And then the total number of shares was fixed and set by Feeding America. A food bank could not purchase more shares with real money. This was done to ensure each food bank's wealth in terms of virtual currency was determined solely by need. And then each day, Feeding America puts about 50 truckloads of food up for sale to food banks. Each truckload is described by the type of food it has and the amount of each food. The types are in lumpy categories like cereal, pasta, meat, protein, and dairy, and the amounts are in pounds of these food. And every day a food bank can place a sealed bid for a specific truckload. Sealed means that other food banks cannot see what bid the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma placed to prevent food banks with more resources from waiting until the last minute and entering a winning bid. So they didn't want a small food bank to have to hire someone to be constantly watching the bids. Now, this bid is in terms of shares, the number of shares a food bank will give up to get the truckload. The highest sealed bid will win the truckload and receives the truckload of food. And then at the end of the day, all of the shares spent on food are then redistributed back to the food banks according to the goal factors. Consider an example. The Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma goes online to see what truckloads are for sale. One has W pounds of rice and Z pounds of cereal, but the bank already has lots of cereal and rice, so it doesn't bid on this truck. However, another truck has X pounds of meat and Y pounds of pasta, both of which are lacking at the food bank, so they enter a sealed bid of 20,000 shares. Now suppose the bank wins that auction. It will then take delivery of the meat and pasta. That's the only auction it wins that day, so that day it spent 20,000 shares. Suppose other food banks spent a total of 950,000 shares. At the end of the day, all of the shares spent are then redistributed back to the food banks based on need. So at the end of this day, there are 20,000 plus 950,000, which equals 970,000 shares to redistribute. What percent of those shares will the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma receive? Well, suppose that its goal factor divided by the sum of all goal factors for all food banks is 0.03. This means that of all the poor people served by all food banks, the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma serves 3% of them. The Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma will then receive 3% of those shares, or 0.03 times 970,000, which equals 29,100 shares. Why are the shares redistributed this way? It's to ensure that the total wealth in shares any food bank has over long periods of time depends only on the number of poor people it serves, relative to the number of poor people served by all food banks. It's a way of ensuring food is distributed solely based on need. The average number of shares the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma will receive will equal 3% times the average number of shares spent on a daily basis, ensuring that, on average, the Regional Food Bank of Oklahoma acquires about 3% of the total food available. There are a few other interesting aspects of this market worth noting. Well, if a food bank has an excess of certain foods, like maybe a huge donation of potatoes, it can then sell it on the market to other food banks and earn extra shares to buy foods it has less of. So when the Idaho Food Bank receives an enormous shipment of potatoes from its surrounding farmers, it can keep some, sell some for shares, and use those shares to buy foods grown in other regions, perhaps sweet corn grown in Florida. A food bank can even borrow shares for a short period of time if it really needs them. Feeding America will sometimes award a specific food bank an unusual number of shares based on specific circumstances, like a hurricane or a recent factory closing. Now let's look at managing the money supply in this market. Another interesting aspect of the virtual market is how they manage the total amount of shares available to all food banks. Recall that the types of goods are described by lumpy categories like pounds of processed vegetables or pounds of rice, and the prices are stated in terms of shares per pound. Feeding America wants the market to have fairly stable prices. For instance, they don't want the average number of shares spent per pound of protein to vary much. Otherwise, if prices were volatile, it would be hard for food banks to plan ahead. Just like the Federal Reserve tries to keep the inflation rate of the U.S. dollar low to make it easier for the economy to plan ahead, Feeding America tries to keep prices stable also. They achieve stable prices in two ways. First, recall that all shares spent are redistributed back to the food banks. So in the short term, the number of shares is fixed. If the number of shares rose and the amount of food available stayed the same, people would have more currency to spend on the same amount of food, so they would bid prices upwards. Likewise, if the number of shares fell and the amount of food stayed the same, food banks would have less money to spend on the same amount of food, so the bids would be lower and prices would fall. And so long as the total amount of shares stays the same and the total amount of food stays the same, prices will be stable. However, the total amount of food does go up and down over time. So if the amount of money / shares doesn't rise and fall with the amount of food, prices will change also. So if the total amount of food to be distributed is tending to increase by, say, 10%, the total amount of shares will be increased by 10%. Otherwise, the amount of money would stay the same, prices would fall. If the total amount of food decreases by 3%, then the total amount of shares decreases by 3%. Otherwise, if the amount of money stayed the same, prices would rise because they have the same amount of money to spend on less food. What this market really does is help Feeding America and food banks communicate what their needs are in order to facilitate a more equitable flow of foods. It helps food banks acquire the food they need while also minimizing waste, and thus increasing the total amount of food available for all food banks. Once the food bank has acquired its food from Feeding America, it will then make it available for purchase by food pantries. This too is a market, but not an auction, and when money is exchanged, it is real money. The executive director of the food pantry will log into a purchasing website like this one. They'll peruse the foods available and make purchases. Sometimes these foods have a positive price, where the food pantry really has to pay money for it, though the price is usually low. Often the food is free. See, often the food was acquired by Feeding America from the U.S. government, and it is then passed along at no cost to the food banks and food pantries. You'll see that on the purchasing system, some of these foods have USDA beside it, meaning it was acquired from the United States Department of Agriculture, a federal government agency. These foods are always free to food pantries. Once the food pantry makes a purchase on this website, it is guaranteed delivery of the item. The food pantry can also use another site to acquire food from food banks, where they acquire perishable items like fruit, vegetables, bread, and refrigerated items. Here, the food pantry can place a request for, say, a pallet of fruit. If available, they will get the pallet of fruit at no cost, but they have no idea what type of fruit will arrive until it's delivered. It could be a pallet of bananas, a pallet of peaches, or something else. That's how the food pantry acquires food from food banks. But they also obtain food through retail recovery, where volunteers make their rounds to grocery stores in town, accepting donations of free food. The stores are able to donate excess food, receive a tax break for the donation, and help the local community. This food is then taken to this room, where it is sorted by volunteers and made available to the needy. Yes, some of these foods are close to the expiration date, but remember how I said that all affiliations in the food pantry system abide by the same rules? Those rules also include when those foods can be made available to the guests relative to their expiration date. And these rules are scientifically formulated to ensure food safety. This food distribution system differs from the conventional food system in a number of ways. Much of the food it distributes is based on the happenstance of availability. For example, in 2019, there was a surplus of milk due to tariffs, and all of a sudden, food pantries found themselves with more milk than they could handle. Some pantries got so much milk they didn't even have room for it and had to keep it in refrigerated trucks. Remember how the food pantry could put in an order for a free pallet of vegetables or fruits? Sometimes that pallet contained a mix of vegetables that store well and that people want in large quantities, and it's consumed quickly. But other times, the entire pallet might contain something like fennel or eggplant, so much that the food pantry can't use it all, and it gets composted. Other times, a pallet of fruit is mostly rotten and must be composted. But most of the time, the food it gets is used, though. The nice thing is that though much of the food that comes here was food that a conventional food system didn't want, it's mostly all high quality and nutritious. The guests always have a large assortment of fresh vegetables to choose from and can usually take as much as they want. You'd be surprised by the high-quality frozen meats they receive, including everything from steaks donated by grocery stores to chicken strips to fish. But because the food is given away and not sold, the inventory tracking system is rather crude. Whereas a grocery store will know every single item that enters the store and when it's sold, a food pantry measures food in pounds. Pounds of cereal, pounds of canned soup, pounds of produce. Because it's given away, it's just not cost effective to keep a detailed inventory. A food pantry also differs in its workforce. Our Daily Bread has 3 to 5 full-time employees at any one time, but they need far more than 5 people to make this place work, and the rest comes from volunteers. Every month, Our Daily Bread receives more than 1,000 volunteer hours. During a shopping session, it's typical to see 12 people acting as shopping assistants, 3 people stocking shelves, 3 people in intake, that's where they check people in, and another 4 people doing other things. Moreover, there are several retired individuals who basically work at least 20 hours per week for free. They mow the grass, tend the garden, drive the trucks for retail recovery, and other things. For every 4 people coming here to acquire food in any one day, there will be 1 person volunteering to help them. And even when Our Daily Bread is closed to shoppers, there will be about 5 volunteers working. A food pantry like Our Daily Bread is certainly about providing food for the needy, but it's also about nurturing and spreading a culture of equality and community. What do I mean by culture? A culture of a society is its way of living, its values, or as the philosopher Roger Scruton often defines it, a common judgment about things. For music, culture is what is good and what is bad music. The same goes for plays, art, even behaviors. The culture of a society is a common assessment of what's desirable and what is not. A society's culture is established through people's behaviors, the objects they surround themselves with, and the rules they establish for themselves and others. A modern food pantry, which they like to call food and resource centers, strives for kindness and community in the following ways. The behavior of volunteers establishes a culture that treats the food insecure as equal neighbors, as part of the community. It is the local community that provides most of the support for Our Daily Bread, and the local community provides over 1,000 volunteer hours each month. Most of the volunteers come here to work and live side by side with the people it serves. They do this because they want to get to know the food insecure, and they want the food insecure to know that they care and that they are their neighbor. Remember how each person obtaining food is giving a shopping assistant? It's not really necessary. Shopping could actually go faster with just a person or two at the end of the aisles giving directions. But Our Daily Bread has shopping assistants anyway because many of the shoppers are elderly and disabled and we want to help them. And giving them free food tells them you care, but being there with them to help them, that proves you care. Remember that the food insecure have a harder time acquiring healthy calories than just volume of calories. We all need to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, and the food pantry culture has evolved to emphasize this. In almost every shopping session, guests are allowed unlimited access to fresh produce, and this isn't because fresh produce is cheaper. Our Daily Bread is surrounded by gardens maintained by volunteers where people can come and pick fresh fruits and vegetables. We do this not because it's cheaper to raise your own produce, it isn't, but because it's a way of communicating to visitors the importance of fresh produce. Cultures tend to surround themselves with objects that express their values. Christians hang crosses on the wall. OSU football fans wear football jerseys on game day. Bumper stickers on our cars express our political affiliation. Likewise, we adorn the outside and the inside of the food pantry with fresh fruits and vegetables as a way of saying, these are the foods we need to be eating more of. Please, let's eat more of it together. One of the most important cultural values expressed in food pantries today is the idea of equality. Every human who is food insecure is considered equally worthy of help. And this wasn't always the case. For instance, during the Irish potato famine, some Protestant poorhouses would only provide help to Protestants. So if you were Catholic and were starving, you had to convert to Protestantism to receive food. Even as recently as 1968, some southern states in the U.S. were intentionally preventing people of color from obtaining food assistance, public assistance including food. This idea of equality is expressed in two ways. One is the behavior of the volunteers here and the surrounding communities. The volunteers come from different churches, different organizations, different political ideologies. We have Christians helping Muslims shop, Democrats stocking shelves for Republicans, people of color checking food insecure white people into the system. There's no discrimination of any kind. If you meet the income requirements and request food, you get it and you'll be greeted with kindness. Another is the laws we pass. Remember how we said food pantries are affiliated with a food bank, and the food bank is affiliated with Feeding America, and that affiliation means they all abide by the same rules. Well, one of those rules is to abide by the federal civil rights laws and the USDA civil rights regulations and policies, which says persons may not be discriminated against based on their race, color, natural origin, religion, sex, gender identity, including gender expression, sexual orientation, disability, age, marital status, family status, income derived from public assistance programs, political beliefs, or reprisal or retaliation for prior credible activity. This is a relatively new cultural value in human civilization, one that all food pantries must abide by to access free food from the federal government. But more important, it's a value that all food pantries and food banks want to follow. It is a value expressed by the federal government at the insistence of voters and a value lived every day by the people who work and volunteer here. So you see, a modern food pantry is not just a place where people can acquire free food during hard financial times. It's an institution propagating the cultural belief that the food insecure are our neighbors, that they deserve not just calories but healthy foods, and they deserve this food so long as their current income is an obstacle. The concept and measure of food insecurity is important because it has become the standard by which we assess the equity of the U.S. food system. If you go to the Feeding America website, and remember Feeding America is the organization that coordinates all the food banks and food pantries, you will immediately see statistics on food insecurity. Recently, one of the things you would see on the website is the claim that 1 in 8 people struggle with hunger. This comes from the fact that the government reports that in 2017, about 12% of people were classified as food insecure. We use changes in food security to assess how the Great Recession around 2008 affected what Americans ate. We use differences in food security rates across ethnicities as a measure of food injustice in the U.S. We measure food security because we care about our citizens. We don't want people to go hungry, and we want them to eat healthy. We don't want minorities to eat a less healthy diet than their counterparts. We measure the reality versus our ideal by the food security concept. Now, food security can be thought of as the formal means by which society converses among itself. We as a society want to know how many people are hungry, how many have to eat cheaper, inexpensive, and less healthy foods. And so we ask each other, are you hungry? Are you eating an unbalanced diet due to money concerns? And we ask this formally through scientific surveys. And then we listen to their responses as they are manifested in food security statistics. From these statistics, we learned that about 12% of people today, this is being filmed in 2019, say they have trouble acquiring food. During the Great Recession, that was closer to about 15%. About 16% of single mothers say they have trouble acquiring food, compared to 4% of married couples with children. Food security is thus a way that Americans talk to Americans, saying, how are you eating? Are you getting enough? Is it a healthy diet? Yet as a form of communication done scientifically using scientifically designed surveys and advanced statistics. Food insecurity is something we measure by asking people about the food situation. These are a formal set of questions developed by scientists after extensive research. Questions asked in the surveys, usually given in person to people. Consider a few of the questions for households without children. One question was, I was worried whether my food would run out before I got money to buy more. Was that often, sometimes, or never true for you in the last 12 months? Another question would be, the food that I bought just didn't last and I didn't have money to buy more. Was that often, sometimes, or never true for you in the last 12 months? Another question, I couldn't afford to eat balanced meals. Was that often, sometimes, or never true for you in the last 12 months? Another example, in the last 12 months, did you ever eat less than you felt you should because there wasn't enough money to pay for food? Yes or no? In the last 12 months, did you ever not eat for a whole day because there wasn't enough money for food? Yes or no? Households without children are asked 10 questions like these, and then to determine if they're food secure, you count the number of affirmative responses, meaning responses indicating food insecurity. For example, when asked whether I was worried whether my food would run out before I got money to buy more, if they answered often or sometimes true, that's coded as an affirmative response. If asked if they didn't eat for a whole day because they couldn't afford food and they answered yes, that's an affirmative response. We must then determine how many affirmative answers must be given before a household is considered food insecure. A set of researchers have determined that for an adult household with no children, they are food insecure if they provide 3 or more affirmative answers out of the 10 questions asked. If 3 to 5 affirmative answers, they are considered to have low food security, and if 6 to 10 affirmative answers, they are considered to have very low food security. This determination was made by scientists, including economists, sociologists, nutritionists, statisticians, by government agencies, and others through extensive discussions, considerations, and data analysis. These persons decided a high food security household is one in which there are absolutely no problems acquiring healthy foods. That described me. I'm able to purchase however much foods of whatever foods I like. A household that has marginal food security is still considered food secure and experiences some anxiety over their ability to acquire food, but is still able to acquire healthy food. This is a household that worries they are stretching their food budget too thin, but nevertheless is able to acquire the foods they desire. Now, a household with low food security reports instances where they not only experience anxiety of acquiring food, but also report a lower level of food quality, variety, or desirability of their diet. This might be a household that acquires plenty of calories but consumes cheap cereal for breakfast instead of more expensive yogurt and fruit. Finally, there's a household with a very low food security. They not only eat less healthy foods than they would like, but they acquire less calories than they would like. And not because they are dieting, but because they have money problems. On the one hand, this concept of food security is subjective, and that is based on what people say in surveys and how researchers and government agencies choose to interpret those answers. On the other hand, it's an objective concept because those questions are focused on identifying actual changes in food eating patterns. For example, when the survey question asks, "I couldn't afford to eat balanced meals," was that often, sometimes, or never true for you in the last 12 months? There's subjectivity here in that different people have different interpretations of what balanced meals means and not being able to afford a balanced meal. It assumes that the household wants to eat a balanced meal, which may or may not be true. It assumes people can and will report the answers accurately and honestly. One person may not be able to afford something because they make very little money, while another may make a decent income but spends most of their money on expensive trucks. And those two don't seem like the same things. One household may really wish they ate a balanced meal but can't, while another really doesn't want to eat a balanced meal even though they know they should, so they say they can't afford it as an excuse. Yet, despite the subjectivity, the questions are focused on asking about the actual foods people eat. The questions look for a real difference in what people eat compared to what they want to eat. While partly subjective, the food security measure has aspects of objectivity because it doesn't ask whether people feel food insecure, but infers food insecurity based on reporting eating behaviors. So that's the food pantry system. Now, as you can see, it's quite different from the conventional food system that most of us rely on for food. The food pantry system recognizes that despite the great wealth generated by the modern world, many households still have trouble acquiring food. The system relies on the kindness of many financial donors and volunteers, as well as government programs. It's a system that goes to great lengths to ensure that the food available for charity is distributed solely on need. It's a system that relies on virtual markets to ensure that distribution is made efficiently, without waste. This is an often overlooked part of the U.S. food system and often underappreciated. I hope this virtual tour rectifies that.